It was Thanksgiving evening, the one night of the year when my father-in-law demanded every member of the family sit at his mahogany dining table in his colonial house in Charlotte, North Carolina. The turkey was carved, the candles were lit, and my father-in-law stood up, tapped his wine glass with a butter knife, and announced to 23 relatives that I had been sleeping with my personal trainer and that his son deserved a real wife, not a, quote, cheap little tramp who couldn't keep her legs closed. 23 faces turned to me. My husband didn't defend me. He just sat there, jaw tight, staring at his plate like it held the answers to the universe. My mother-in-law reached over and patted his arm as though he were the victim. My sister-in-law actually smirked. And me? I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I calmly pulled out my phone, connected it to the 75-inch smart TV mounted above the fireplace, and played a video that burned the entire family's so-called legacy to the ground in under 45 seconds. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. I met my husband, Jason, during my junior year at UNC Chapel Hill. He was a senior, business major, charming in that effortless Southern way where every sentence ended with a grin and every door got held open. His family had money, old Charlotte money, the kind that came with a last name people recognized at country clubs and charity galas. His father, Richard, ran a commercial real estate firm that had been in the family for 3 generations. His mother, Diane, had never worked a day in her life but treated her role as family matriarch like a full-time executive position. She organized every holiday, managed every social appearance, and controlled every narrative about who the family was and how they were perceived. I grew up in a middle-class family in Raleigh. My dad was a high school football coach and my mom was a dental hygienist. Good people, honest people. But not the kind of people who summered anywhere or had a wing named after them at the local hospital. When Jason brought me home for the first time, I could feel Diane sizing me up the moment I walked through the front door. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were calculating, running an appraisal on my shoes, my posture, my accent, my worth. I passed whatever test she was running that day, but barely. We got married 2 years after I graduated. The wedding was beautiful, but it wasn't mine. Diane planned every detail, from the venue at the Myers Park Country Club to the specific shade of ivory on the napkins. My mother quietly suggested adding a few of our family traditions, maybe my grandmother's pecan pie recipe for the dessert table, and Diane shut it down with a smile so polished it could cut glass. "That's not really the aesthetic we're going for," she said. "We." As if she and I were a team. As if my own wedding was a group project and she held the final grade. I should have seen the signs then. But I loved Jason, and I believed that love was enough to survive his family. For 3 years, I told myself that story. I repeated it like a prayer every time Diane made a passive-aggressive comment about my cooking, my career, my decision to keep working as a marketing coordinator instead of staying home. "You know," she'd say at family dinners, "I raised 3 children and managed this entire household without ever needing to work outside the home. I always felt that a wife's presence in the home is what holds a family together." She'd look at me when she said it, that saccharine smile never leaving her face, and Jason would say nothing. He'd chew his food, change the subject, or suddenly need to refill his drink. His silence was its own kind of violence. Not the loud kind, not the kind that leaves bruises, the slow kind, the kind that erodes you from the inside, like water wearing through stone. Every time I tried to talk to him about it afterward, in the car, in bed, in the quiet moments where a husband should be honest, he'd say the same thing. "That's just how Mom is. She doesn't mean anything by it. Can you just let it go for me?" And I would. Every single time, I would let it go. Because I loved him. Because I wanted peace. Because I thought if I was patient enough, kind enough, good enough, eventually they would accept me. I was wrong. The cracks really started to show when Jason's younger sister, Megan, got divorced. She'd married a man named Tyler, a financial analyst who turned out to have a gambling problem and a talent for hiding debt. When their marriage fell apart, Megan moved back into the family house. She was bitter, angry, and she aimed every ounce of that bitterness directly at me. I think she resented that my marriage was still intact while hers had crumbled. She'd make snide comments about how I probably kept secrets from Jason. How women who worked long hours always had something to hide. Diane never corrected her. If anything, she encouraged it with little nods and knowing looks. I became the family's designated target. The person everyone could project their own failures onto because I was the outsider, the one who didn't share their blood or their last name by birth. Then, about 8 months before that Thanksgiving, I started noticing something I couldn't explain away. It began with Richard, my father-in-law. He'd always been a commanding presence, the kind of man who expected everyone in the room to orient themselves around him. He ran his family the way he ran his business, with authority, hierarchy, and zero tolerance for dissent. But underneath that patriarch persona, I started catching glimpses of something else. Little things at first. The way he'd disappear for hours on Saturday afternoons, claiming he was at the office. The way he'd step outside to take phone calls, lowering his voice the moment anyone came near. The way Diane's jaw would tighten almost imperceptibly whenever he mentioned working late. One evening, I stopped by the family house to drop off a casserole dish Diane had lent me. It was a Tuesday, around 7. Jason was at a conference in Atlanta. I rang the doorbell and no one answered, but Richard's car was in the driveway. I walked around to the side door that led through the sunroom, a door that was usually unlocked. It was. I stepped inside and immediately heard voices coming from the upstairs study. Richard's voice, low and intimate, and a woman's laugh that was not Diane's. I froze. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my temples. Every instinct told me to leave, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, to put the dish on the kitchen counter and walk out. And that's exactly what I did. I set the casserole dish down and I left. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do with what I'd heard. I didn't even know for certain what I'd heard. Maybe it was the television. Maybe he had a colleague over. Maybe I was overreacting the way Diane always implied I did. But the seed was planted, and once you start looking, you can't stop seeing. Over the next few weeks, I paid attention. I noticed Richard's phone was always face down on the table. I noticed he'd started going to the gym, something he'd never done in the 28 years Diane had known him. I noticed new cologne, new shirts, a sudden interest in his appearance that seemed out of character for a 61-year-old man who'd always been content with khakis and golf polos. And then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The woman. I saw her. It was at a restaurant downtown. I was having lunch with a colleague near Uptown Charlotte when I spotted Richard at a corner booth with a woman at least 20 years younger than him. She was blonde, well-dressed, leaning in close. His hand was on top of hers on the table. They weren't being especially discreet, just confident that no one who mattered would see them. But I saw them, and I took a photo. Not because I had a plan. Not because I wanted revenge. I took it because I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind, that the family who constantly told me I was too sensitive, too suspicious, too much, had been hiding something monstrous of their own. After that, I couldn't stop. I became quietly, methodically observant. I checked Richard's public calendar through the company website and cross-referenced his supposed work events with his actual whereabouts. I noticed patterns. Every other Wednesday afternoon, he'd leave the office early. On those days, his assistant would tell anyone who called that he was in meetings. I drove by his office on one of those Wednesdays. His car wasn't there. It was parked outside a townhouse in the Dilworth neighborhood, a property that, when I searched the county tax records, was owned by a woman named Victoria Lane. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching the front door. When Richard finally came out, adjusting his tie with a satisfied look on his face, I felt something crystallize inside me. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was clarity. The man who ruled his family with an iron fist, who preached loyalty and honor at every holiday table, who would later stand up at Thanksgiving dinner and call me a tramp in front of his entire family, this man had been living a double life for God knows how long. I debated what to do for weeks. Tell Jason? He'd never believe me. He worshipped his father. Tell Diane? She'd probably already suspected and chosen denial, or worse, she'd blame me for bringing it up. Go to Megan? She'd twist it into ammunition against me somehow. I realized I had no allies in that family. I was alone. So I decided to protect myself the only way I could. I gathered evidence, not to use as a weapon, but as a shield. If the day ever came when they turned on me, and deep down I knew it would, I wanted proof that their moral high ground was built on quicksand. I didn't hire a private investigator. I didn't need to. Richard was arrogant in his secrecy, the way powerful men often are. He assumed no one in his orbit would ever dare question him. I took more photos over the following months. I documented dates and times. And then, one afternoon when I was parked near the Dilworth townhouse, I watched through the window as Richard and Victoria stood in the living room in an embrace that left absolutely nothing to interpretation. I recorded it on my phone. The video was clear, damning, and 45 seconds long, 45 seconds that could end a dynasty. I saved copies everywhere. My cloud drive, a USB in my desk at work, another in a safe deposit box at a bank branch Jason didn't know about. I prayed I'd never have to use any of it, but the universe had other plans. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were tense. Megan had been especially hostile, making comments at a Sunday brunch about how I was always on my phone, always texting someone. "Who are you talking to all the time?" she asked, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Your boyfriend?" She laughed like it was a joke, but her eyes were sharp. Diane pursed her lips in that way she did when she agreed with something but wanted plausible deniability. Jason said nothing. Then I found out through a friend who worked at my gym that someone had been asking questions about me and my personal trainer, Derek. Derek was a 45-year-old married father of 3 who had trained me twice a week for the past year. Our relationship was completely professional. But someone had been calling the gym, asking the front desk staff if I spent a lot of time with my trainer, if we seemed close, if we ever left together. My friend said the caller was a woman. She didn't leave a name. I knew immediately it was Megan. Or Diane. Or both. They were building a case against me, manufacturing evidence of an affair that didn't exist, probably had been for weeks. The Sunday brunch comments, the pointed questions, the way Richard had started looking at me with cold appraisal, like a judge preparing a verdict. It was coordinated, calculated. They were going to use Thanksgiving, the one event where the entire extended family gathered, to publicly destroy me. And they did. Richard stood up at that table with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged in his own home. He said he had received concerning information. He said multiple sources had confirmed I was having an inappropriate relationship with a man at my gym. He said he was heartbroken. Just heartbroken. That his son had been betrayed this way. He pulled out his phone and showed a photo of me and Derek leaving the gym together, walking to our cars in the parking lot, a photo so mundane and innocent it could have been anyone leaving any building. But in the context he'd built, with the narrative he'd poisoned the family with for weeks, it looked like proof. I looked at Jason. This was the moment. The moment a husband stands up and says, "That's my wife, and I trust her, and I won't let you do this." But Jason just sat there. His jaw was clenched. His hands were flat on the table. He wouldn't look at me. And I understood then with brutal clarity that he had known this was coming. Maybe he didn't plan it, but he knew, and he chose to let it happen because it was easier to sacrifice me than to stand up to his father. The table erupted. Diane shook her head in exaggerated disappointment. Megan crossed her arms with a smug expression that made my skin crawl. Jason's uncle muttered something about what happens when you marry outside the family's circle. 23 people looked at me like I was the disease that had infected their perfect bloodline. Something shifted inside me. Not broke. Shifted. Like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting to open for 3 years. I felt eerily calm. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened the Smart TV app, the same one Jason had set up months ago so we could cast family photos during gatherings. I connected in 3 taps. The TV above the fireplace, the one currently displaying a screensaver of autumn leaves, flickered. Richard was still talking, still performing his righteous monologue, when the screen changed. Suddenly, the entire room was looking at a high-definition video of Richard and a blonde woman in an unmistakable embrace inside a townhouse living room, his hands on her waist, her lips on his neck. The angle was clear. The faces were recognizable. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. No way out. The silence that followed was unlike anything I've ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was the total absence of sound, as if the room itself had stopped breathing. Richard's face drained of color so fast I thought he might collapse. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Diane stared at the screen, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to devastation in a span of seconds. Her hand went to her chest. She made a sound, a small, strangled noise, like something essential had just been severed inside her. Megan's smug expression crumbled. She looked at her father, then at the screen, then at her father again, as if trying to rearrange reality into something she could accept. She couldn't. I picked up the remote and paused the video at the most damning frame. Then I looked at Richard. "You were saying something about betrayal?" My voice was steady, almost pleasant. "I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on the subject." Richard lunged for the remote. "Give me that. Turn it off." But Jason's uncle, the same man who'd muttered about marrying outside the circle, grabbed Richard's arm. "Sit down, Richard. Sit down right now." The authority in his voice surprised everyone, including Richard, who stumbled back into his chair like a puppet with cut strings. Diane stood up. Her composure, that legendary Diane composure that had held this family together through decades of social performance, finally shattered. She looked at Richard with eyes I will never forget. Eyes that held not just anger, but years of confirmed suspicion, years of choosing not to see what she already knew. "How long?" she whispered. Richard couldn't speak. "How long?" she screamed, and the wine glasses rattled. What followed was chaos. Richard tried to deny it, then minimize it, then redirect blame. "It's not what it looks like. She means nothing. This is a private matter, and Sarah had no right." But every excuse he offered only made him look worse. The family watched their patriarch dissolve in real time, watched the man who had spent decades positioning himself as the moral center of their world get exposed as a fraud. Megan started crying. Not for her father's affair, but for herself, for the realization that the family structure she'd clung to after her own divorce was built on lies. She had chosen her father's side, her mother's side. This family's side over basic decency toward me, and now the foundation she'd chosen was crumbling beneath her feet. And Jason. Jason finally looked at me. His expression was something between horror and shame, the face of a man who suddenly understood the magnitude of what he'd allowed to happen. He had let his father publicly humiliate his wife based on fabricated accusations while his father was living a double life. The irony was so grotesque it barely needed to be stated, but I stated it anyway. "You sat there," I said to him, quietly enough that only he and the people closest to us could hear. "You sat there and let your father call me a tramp. You knew this was planned. You let it happen. And the whole time, he was the one betraying this family. Not me. Never me." Jason's eyes filled with tears. He reached for my hand. I pulled it away. I stood up, addressed the room one final time. "I have copies of everything. I'm not going to distribute them or post them online because unlike the people at this table, I don't destroy others for sport. But if anyone in this family contacts me, harasses me, or tries to interfere with my life going forward, I will send every piece of evidence I have to Richard's business partners, his clients, and every media outlet in Charlotte. That is not a threat. That is a promise." Then I walked out. I didn't run. I didn't slam the door. I picked up my coat from the hallway rack, put it on, and left that house for the last time. I drove to my parents' house in Raleigh that night. My mom opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without a word. I told them everything over cups of coffee at the kitchen table while my dad sat there with his hands folded, his jaw working the way it does when he's trying very hard not to say something he'll regret. When I finished, he looked at me and said, "You're coming home. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." And for the first time in 3 years, I felt safe. The divorce was straightforward. Jason didn't contest it. I think whatever fight he might have had left was extinguished that Thanksgiving night. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, who specialized in high-asset divorces, made sure I received an equitable settlement. She said the video of Richard's affair, combined with the documented pattern of family harassment, gave us significant leverage. The family wanted this resolved quietly and quickly. I was happy to oblige. On my terms. Jason texted me once during the proceedings. It said, "I should have protected you. I'm sorry I was too weak." I read it, then put my phone down. He was right on both counts. But sorry doesn't rebuild what silence destroys. The aftermath for the family was severe. Richard and Diane separated within 2 months. Diane moved to their vacation house in Hilton Head and filed for divorce. The settlement, I heard through mutual acquaintances, was substantial. Diane had spent 30 years building the social infrastructure of that family, and she wasn't going to walk away empty-handed. Richard's affair became an open secret in Charlotte's business community. He didn't lose his company, men like him rarely do, but he lost the respect and the social currency that had meant more to him than money. His partners distanced themselves. The country club invitations dried up. The man who had stood at the head of that Thanksgiving table with such authority was now eating alone at restaurants where nobody knew his name. Megan called me 2 months after the divorce was finalized. I almost didn't answer. She was crying before she even finished saying hello. She told me she was sorry. She told me she'd been so consumed by the wreckage of her own marriage that she'd channeled all her pain into tearing mine apart. She said she'd been the one calling the gym, asking about Derek, gathering the so-called evidence her father used against me. She confessed that it had been her idea to do it at Thanksgiving, to make it public, to force Jason's hand. She thought if my marriage ended, she wouldn't feel so alone in her failure. I listened to every word. And when she was done, I told her the truth. I said I didn't hate her. I said I understood how pain can make people cruel. But I also said that understanding isn't the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation. I wished her well, and I meant it, but I had no interest in keeping her in my life. Jason sold the house in Charlotte and took a job in Nashville. The last I heard, he was living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, working long hours and seeing a therapist twice a week. Part of me hopes the therapy helps. Part of me knows that some lessons can only be learned by living through the consequences, not by talking about them in a comfortable office. As for me, I rebuilt. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't glamorous. I moved back to Raleigh, found a better job at a digital marketing agency, and slowly reassembled a life that was entirely mine. I adopted a rescue dog named Biscuit who has terrible manners and the warmest brown eyes you've ever seen. I started running in the mornings, not to look good for anyone, but because the rhythm of my feet on pavement reminded me that I was still here, still moving forward. About a year after the divorce, I met someone. His name is David. He's a pediatrician, divorced, father of a 6-year-old boy named Sam. We met at a farmer's market of all places, arguing politely over the last carton of local strawberries. He let me have them. I invited him to share. We sat on a bench in the sunshine, eating strawberries and talking about nothing important, and it was the lightest I'd felt in years. David is nothing like Jason, not because Jason was inherently bad, but because David is inherently brave. He says what he means. He stands beside me, not behind his family's expectations. The first time he met my parents, my dad pulled him aside and I'm sure gave him some version of the speech. David came back smiling and said, "Your dad told me that if I ever make you cry, he knows people." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my sweet tea. We got married last spring. Small ceremony, my parents' backyard, string lights and magnolia branches, 30 people who actually loved us. My mom made her pecan pie for the dessert table, and it was the best thing anyone ate that night. No one controlled the napkin color. No one performed for an audience. It was just real, and real turned out to be more beautiful than perfect ever was. I ran into Diane once, about 6 months ago, at a boutique in Raleigh. She was visiting a friend and looked different, smaller somehow, but also lighter, like a woman who'd set down a burden she'd been carrying for decades. We made eye contact across a rack of summer dresses. She walked over. I braced myself. But she just said, "You look happy, Sarah. I hope you are." And I said, "I am." She nodded, and I could see something complicated in her eyes. Regret, maybe, or recognition that we'd both been trapped in the same house of mirrors, just in different rooms. She touched my arm briefly, then walked away. I don't tell this story to gloat. I don't tell it because revenge felt good, though I won't pretend that moment at the Thanksgiving table wasn't satisfying, because it was. I tell it because for 3 years, I sat quietly while people who claimed to love me systematically tore me down. I smiled when I wanted to scream. I apologized when I'd done nothing wrong. I shrank myself to fit inside a life that was never designed to hold me. And the thing that finally saved me wasn't patience or kindness or turning the other cheek. It was the decision to stop being silent, to stop letting other people write my story, to stand up in the middle of their carefully constructed narrative and say, "No, this is what actually happened, here is the truth, and I am done pretending otherwise." If you're sitting in that silence right now, if you're reading this, and recognizing your own life in the shape of mine, I want you to know something. You are not crazy. You are not too sensitive. You are not the problem. And the people who tell you that you are? Look closely at what they're hiding, because in my experience, the ones who shout loudest about loyalty are usually the ones with the most to cover up. The accuser is almost always the one with the dirtiest secret. You deserve a table where no one ambushes you. You deserve a partner who stands up, not one who stares at his plate. You deserve a life that doesn't require you to shrink. And if the people around you can't give you that, then it's not your table. Walk away from it. Build your own. Set it with whatever dishes you want, and invite only the people who actually deserve a seat. Trust me, the other side of that door is worth every terrifying step it takes to reach it. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below. Share your own experience if you feel comfortable, and if you know someone who needs to hear this right now, send it to them. Sometimes the thing that saves us is knowing we're not alone. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. I'll see you in the next one.